Who are the first serial killers in Russia? Have you ever heard their story? One of the most notorious female assassins is usually Daria Saltykova, who you probably know as the Bloody Lady. However, he is credited with only 38 proven murders. Exactly 60 years later, a woman appeared who, according to official statistics, had 128 victims, including about 40 children under the age of 14. The name of the owner of the land, Olga Briskorn, is famous among Pushkin enthusiasts. Alexander Pushkin lived with his wife in 1831 to 1832 at house number 225 on Galernaya Street in St. Petersburg, which belonged to the Briskorn nobleman. However, Ms. Briskorn is remembered in Russian history for very different reasons. Like the infamous Saltykova, she was responsible for the deaths of over 100 of her subjects. While Saltykova has 38 confirmed kills, our subject today has 128 confirmed kills. However, estimates suggest that the Bloody Lady may have claimed more than 300 lives. So let's find out why he killed so many people. Boyarina Olga Konstantinovna, born in 1776, was from an aristocratic Moldavian family descended from the sons of Bessarabia. She was the daughter of the wealthy landowner Konstantin Ivanovich Movin and his wife, Tatiana Vasilievna Kristoforova. Olga's father made his fortune in the salt industry in the Crimea, which he bought from the Potemkin monopoly. With this wealth, he bought several properties, and when Olga was 17 years old, he married the wealthy Andrei Strukov, one of the leading figures in Ekaterinoslav's nobility. On February 11, 1793, Olga officially married Strukov, one of the richest men of the time, and received a dowry of 56,000 rubles. After a profitable marriage, Olga became a leading lady among Ekaterinoslav's elite. A young woman in her early 30s, well-read and witty, she was deeply interested in theater and amateur artistic endeavors. Thanks to her, the first theater appeared in Ekaterinoslav, now Dnipro. Very little is known about her appearance, except that Olga was very beautiful and had a good figure. After 13 years of marriage, in 1806, Olga Strukova became a widow. She moved to St. Petersburg, where she wanted to provide a good education for her children, and a year and a half later remarried under quite original circumstances. The secret counselor and Senator Fyodor von Brand was involved in a lawsuit with Strukova over some matter, and in order to resolve it favorably, he decided to marry her. From her first marriage, Olga had 2 sons, and from her second marriage, she had 2 daughters. Now we come to the most interesting part. Later, people nicknamed her estate the Death Factory. Much younger than her, Olga Konstantinovna managed all affairs and was involved in purchasing property. In 1809, she bought 2 villages in the Dmitrievsky district of Kursk province at an auction in St. Petersburg. Olga Briskorn lived with her family in St. Petersburg and was known as a patron and philanthropist who generously helped the poor. Therefore, one can imagine the surprise of Alexander I when he received complaints from Christians of Dmitrievsky district in Kursk province. In 1817, Olga Briskorn owned the villages of Prilipy, Dubovitsy, Ob, and Klevnya, with a population of 2,000. An investigation into the complaints began in 1822 at the behest of Count Arakcheyev and lasted 3 years. The outcome of the investigation was a multi-volume case about the chaotic management of her serfs. Olga Briskorn built a 3-story factory and quickly drove her serfs into poverty. Since then, she lived a double life, trying to appear pious in St. Petersburg while being known for a very different behavior in Kursk province. Her estate was colossal, with the number of serfs reaching up to 5,000 across all her properties. In addition to this, she owned multiple properties, including in the capital. The capital accumulated by her husband amounted to 200,000 rubles. Her wool factory employed 392 serfs who were ruthlessly exploited by their greedy mistress, working grueling 14 to 15-hour days, and even being forced to sleep on straw in the workshop, not allowed to go home. Under heavy physical strain, workers suffered from hunger, receiving only bread with bran, thin cabbage soup, a spoonful of porridge, and minimal amounts of rotten meat for lunch. Olga Briskorn extensively used child labor at her factory, where 91 children aged 7 to 15 worked. The faces of the exhausted and the fallen eyes depicted the extreme exhaustion of the unfortunate workers, as described in the letters of Lepsky peasants and Romanov. At another estate, the landlord's brick factory also employed children and women. Pregnant women suffered miscarriages due to the heavy workload. According to a commission's report, in the early 1820s at the woolen factory, 128 people died from injuries, hunger, and disease, including 44 children. Only 74 workers were buried according to Orthodox rites, while others were buried in mass graves without any funeral service. The landlady, Briskorn, ordered the closing of communal graves without any services. Not only was she indifferent to mortality, but her absolute power over people revealed sadistic tendencies. She allowed overseers to torture serfs with whips and rods. 55 people were beaten by Briskorn's orders, and she personally participated in some instances of punishment. She would strike peasants herself, sometimes pulling their hair, but more often hitting the guilty with a wooden stick, which would often break from the force of the blows. One peasant lost his hearing after being struck in the head with a stick and in the face with a log. The commission's materials also mention an unfortunate girl who lost her hand due to a broken arm, which then became infected. According to priest Alexander Kirilov, Briskorn even tortured her manager, Yakov Bugayev, by thrusting a burning candle into his mouth. Despite severe injuries to the victims, the investigation report seems to downplay the severity of the cruelty. Given the extent of Briskorn's brutality, it is not surprising that 150 people from her villages fled to escape her. In some instances, she shackled serfs with chains and iron horns. Elsewhere, Olga Briskorn's management was similarly harsh. In the Yekaterinoslav province, in 1811, 300 serfs fled to Moldova. At the estate of Pyataya Gora, the serfs revolted, requiring military intervention to quell. Other offenses of the landlady, such as treachery towards her husband, were also revealed. Although it might be tempting to attribute Olga Briskorn's cruelty to her Romanian origins, it is worth noting that such tyrants as Karaiva and Elizabeth Bate, from Transylvanian princely families, also emerged from that region. However, the real cause of the landlady's cruelty was the powerless position of her serfs under the existing laws in Russia. These people were effectively not subjects of the emperor, but slaves of their masters. The Kursk bureaucracy turned a blind eye to the plight of the serfs, dismissing the peasants' complaints as baseless. Regarding the alleged accidental death at the Briskorn estate, unlike Daria Saltykova, Madame Briskorn faced only a mild scare and moral condemnation from society. Her woolen factory was transferred to state management, and the estate was placed under the guardianship of the landlady's son. As noted by a Kursk historian, despite the extensive testimony and documentation in the Briskorn case, the bureaucracy seemed indifferent. The father of her husband, Fyodor Brisk, rose to become a court apothecary under Paul I. However, Fyodor Brisk could not withstand the disgrace and died in 1824. In memory of her husband, Olga Briskorn built several churches, possibly hoping to atone for her sins before God. In the village of Pyataya Gora, a church built by her in 1826 still stands. In 1836, the sadistic widow died in St. Petersburg from a stroke, leaving her children a large fortune estimated at 110,000 rubles, extensive land holdings, and 3,000 serfs. Daria Saltykova and Olga Briskorn are known for their large number of murdered victims, but can they be called maniacs? One individual who can certainly be called the first serial killer and maniac of Russia is Nikolai Radkevich, known as the Petersburg Jack the Ripper. He began his criminal activities precisely when the search for Jack the Ripper was underway in London. Born in 1888, merchant navy sailor Nikolai Radkevich, also known as Vadim Krovnyaki, became the first serial killer and maniac in the history of St. Petersburg and Russia. The exact date and place of Radkevich's birth are not known, but according to his own confessions, he was a cadet in the Arakcheyev era but did not succeed. The new suitor of the woman subdued the failed criminal and took him to the police station. After the scandal was suppressed, the young man was expelled from the cadet corps and decided that his life's mission was to cleanse the world of immoral women. His first murder occurred in June 1909. His victim was 20-year-old Anna Blumentrost, who earned a living by prostituting herself. Radkevich inflicted 12 stab wounds to her face, neck, and shoulders, then threw her body into the Neva River. On July 1st, the body was recovered and identified in St. Petersburg, causing panic among the city's women of ill repute. The police began a vigorous manhunt for the brutal maniac. Within 2 weeks, the killer struck again. On July 14, 1909, Radkevich met his next victim at Znamenskia Square. Her name was Ekaterina Jaris. He took her to the Denai Hotel, located on Legovsky Prospect at that time, and booked room 9 on the 3rd floor. Ekaterina was a regular guest at the hotel and had come that day with a new client, a young man dressed in a long black coat and a broad black hat despite the heat. They ordered dinner in the room, and at 9 p.m., the bellboy brought a bottle of wine and candy. That night, Radkevich inflicted at least 20 stab wounds on Jaris, but not killing her in that manner. He then strangled her. The next morning at 8 a.m., Radkevich left the room, telling the bellboy to wake his companion in an hour. The servant noticed that the client's hands were unnaturally long. When the bellboy discovered Jaris's body an hour later, he tried to wake her, but received no response. The young man peered through the keyhole and screamed in horror. The bed was covered with the bloodied body of the young woman. Investigators concluded that both murders were committed by the same criminal due to their similarities. Panic spread among the city's women of ill repute, and soon it became clear that even respectable women could not feel safe. On July 24, 1909, Radkevich attacked a maid named Zinata Lavina, shouting death to beauties as he began stabbing her. However, he was frightened off by passers-by and fled without finishing the attack. The city was thrown into panic. Women were afraid to leave their homes, and children were kept under close watch, even at school. Yuliy Radkevich committed another failed attack on a woman of ill repute at a cheap brothel on Kolomensky Street. He secluded himself with a woman named Clodaldy, but instead of engaging in sexual activities, he attempted to stab her. The woman was strong enough to escape despite her wounds, and her screams attracted the attention of everyone in the brothel. However, the criminal managed to escape through a window. Radkevich, who often introduced himself as Vadim Krovnyaki, which gave him his nickname, was initially difficult to catch, possibly due to this alias. The investigation into Radkevich's case was led by Vladimir Filipov, the head of the St. Petersburg Criminal Police, who had solved several high-profile cases of the era. At that time, the only common feature identified among the victims was that they were all brunettes. What motivated the criminal remained a mystery. An experienced detective speculated that the killer might be connected to the Navy, possibly as a sailor on a ship. This theory was supported by the killer's appearance and the fact that the weapon used in the crimes was a knife commonly used by sailors. The police began to visit all the port taverns and question local drunks and vagrants. By the end of July, detectives picked up a lead at a tavern where a tall man with long arms was frequently seen. He often drank there and interacted with other patrons. Detectives learned that a regular customer at this establishment was someone named Vadim, an unbalanced, hostile misogynist who claimed that the police would never catch the murderer. This Vadim had said he used to serve in the merchant navy and now lived in a flophouse. Witness testimonies confirmed that the suspect had indeed served as a sailor in the merchant navy and showed interest in the recent murders. At the tavern, he was known by the name Vadim Krovnyaki, and one of his drinking companions even had his address, where he regularly stayed. The investigators immediately went to this address, but their search was in vain. The man named Vadim Krovnyaki, whom the locals remembered well, had moved out a few days before their visit. Meanwhile, the murders in St. Petersburg had ceased. Reports of similar crimes began reaching Filipov from Riga, Königsberg, and other port cities, committed at various times. This led the head of the criminal police to suspect that Vadim had once served on one of the ships from St. Petersburg. He ordered a cross-check of the crew lists of all the ships in St. Petersburg against the lists of lodgers at the flophouses. After some time, detectives discovered a match. Nikolai Radkevich turned out to be a former sailor on a ship. Knowing the criminal's name, It seemed that finding him should be straightforward, but the detectives were once again too late. In the room Radkevich had rented, they only found a note that read, "Death to beauties." The last murder committed by the maniac took place on September 19th, 1909. On that day, following the pattern of previous attacks, he had lured a woman to a hotel under the pretense of paying her for her services. Later, on Maria's body, investigators found 35 stab wounds. Experts determined that, in addition to the murder, she had been robbed and a note was left at the head of the bed. Money taken for the labor of sending to the other world, as it is no longer needed by the dead. The woman, Ekaterina Jaris, was killed in the Denai Hotel. The bellboy, however, was vigilant. Upon noticing the body through the keyhole, he raised an alarm. Radkevich tried to resist the bellboy, stabbing him with a knife, but the hotel staff subdued the maniac. Radkevich was so confident that he would never be caught that he even wrote his alias in the note. The capital's press quickly dubbed the criminal Petersburg Jack the Ripper. The similarity was that both targeted women who sold their bodies, but there were differences. The English maniac typically dismembered his victims, whereas the Petersburg serial killer never did. Initially, Radkevich was placed in the psychiatric hospital of St. Nicholas the Wonderworker on the banks of the Pryaska River. Opinions among psychologists were divided. Some considered him a sadistic individual fully responsible for his actions, while others viewed him as a degenerate with congenital defects trapped by false grandiose ideas. Ultimately, the maniac faced trial. On March 10, 1912, a jury convicted Nikolai Radkevich to 8 years of hard labor. In the fall of 1916, he was killed by one of his fellow prisoners. Today, we will talk about Shabalovka's murderer, the first serial killer in the history of the Soviet Union. He killed 9 victims and instilled fear in the hearts of Muscovites. When Komarov was caught, the townspeople wanted to lynch him, and the trial of the maniac, which took place in the Polytechnic Museum, was covered by Mikhail Bulgakov himself. What were his motives and why is his case one of the strangest and most unusual? Many videos have already been made about him, but I want to present my own version of the case. Therefore, I would appreciate a like and a subscription after watching the video, and please share your thoughts on the topic in the comments. Vasily Komarov was born in 1877 in Vitebsk province. At birth, he received the surname Petrov after his father, Terenty. The latter was an ordinary railroad worker who did not achieve much. However, he had a strong fondness for alcoholic beverages, a penchant for alcohol that was not only shared by him, but also by all the members of his large family. The fate of many of his children is unknown, but one of Vasily Komarov's brothers ended his life in hard labor, sentenced there for the murder of his own boss, an offense committed under the influence of alcohol. Komarov started working early as a shepherd, and he began drinking at the age of 10, consuming everything from homemade liquor to spirits. Despite this, the future maniac was remarkably healthy, rarely falling ill. At 16, Komarov began working for a local landowner. However, the landowner was greedy, and Vasily soon changed employers. Unfortunately, the new job did not suit him either. Although the pay was good, the work was hard. Eventually, Komarov took a job as a repairman on the railroad with his father. All his earnings were spent on alcohol and snacks, but money was often insufficient, leading Komarov to steal from his neighbors. Komarov's heavy drinking came to an end when he was conscripted into the army at the age of 20. After returning to Vitebsk 4 years later, Vasily decided to start a family and soon married a fellow villager. The model of family relations from his own parents was repeated in his own family. He and his wife, who turned out to be extremely jealous, often drank, quarreled, and fought. Nevertheless, their life cannot be described as dull, as the couple traveled extensively across the Russian Empire, with alcohol keeping them from getting bored. To buy alcohol and snacks, money was needed, so Vasily decided to carry out a scam by selling a batch of dried apples and other provisions on the side. After being caught and ending up in court, he served his sentence. After leaving his jealous wife, Komarov moved to Riga, which he had heard many good things about from ex-convicts. Once, while in his native Vitebsk, Vasily learned that his financially struggling wife had betrayed him, poisoned herself, and died. Vasily did not mourn for long and, returning to Riga, remarried. His new wife was a Polish widow with 2 children. She was hardworking and abstinent, but Komarov, accustomed to a different model of family life, often used violence against her and her children. Despite this, his wife endured the abuse because Komarov provided for the family. Eventually, she became involved in his cruel crimes. In 1915, the Komarov family moved to the Volga region to escape the advancing German troops. With the start of the revolution, Vasily supported the Reds and actively contributed to their cause. He managed to portray himself as an innocent victim of the Tsarist regime during his imprisonment, and the details of his past were not scrutinized in those turbulent times. Komarov learned to read and write and began to actively fight against the counter-revolution, eventually reaching the rank of an officer sentenced to execution. It was during this time that Vasily made a significant discovery. He realized he enjoyed taking people's lives. Once, Komarov was captured by the Whites, but through his cunning and resourcefulness, he managed to avoid death. What happened to him while in White captivity remains a mystery, but a year later he returned to Moscow as if nothing had happened. By that time, he had abandoned his surname Petrov, officially became Komarov, and amassed a substantial fortune. He had enough money to buy a nice house on Shabalovka, and the true origins of his wealth remain unknown. According to one version, Komarov agreed to become a spy for the Whites while in captivity. However, a more plausible version suggests that during the chaotic years of the revolution, Vasily engaged in theft and robbery, accumulating his fortune in this manner. The Komarov family lived comfortably for several years, but as time passed, their money ran out. By early 1921, with the new economic policy announced in the country, Vasily became a horse-drawn carriage driver. Ivanania transported goods and people, and on the side committed petty theft. He switched to private carriage driving, but worked for Komarov in a peculiar way, rarely taking passengers and mostly spending his time at the horse market. Later, in court, Vasily explained that he decided to combat the influx of speculators. In February 1921, a typical peasant came to Moscow to buy a horse. Traders at the horse market directed him to Komarov, suggesting that he was just about to sell his horse. The peasant and Vasily agreed on a deal and went to Shabalovka for the final settlement. Just before, the homeowner had wisely sent his wife and children on an outing. As was customary, they decided to celebrate the deal. The peasant quickly became drunk, grew trustful of Komarov, and began to share his plans. He would return to his village with the horse, exchange it for grain, and later sell it in Moscow for a profit. Later, in court, Komarov confessed that at that moment, he felt an incredible surge of hatred towards the peasant. Komarov left, supposedly to get some alcohol, but instead grabbed a hammer from the closet and struck the guest on the head. Mikhail Bulgakov, who covered the Komarov case as a correspondent, described the scene. The cattle are beaten without remorse, but also without any hatred. They benefited, but not fantastically. The buyer had approximately the cost of the horse in his pocket, but no wealth in his belongings. However, he drank and ate, managing to find money and support his family. Komarov had what might be called a slaughterhouse at home. He bound the victim's hands and feet to his stomach, packed the body in a sack, and dragged it to a neighboring abandoned plot with a semi-ruined house. Over time, he hid many bodies there. Soon after his first crime, Komarov began hunting regularly. He found his victims at the horse market, using the same scheme, making acquaintances, negotiating a sale, and offering to celebrate the deal. At Vasily's home, the hammer, rope, and a zinc trough awaited. The maniac used the rope to strangle those he didn't kill with the first blow and positioned the zinc trough under the wounds to catch the blood, preventing stains on the floor. One of the witnesses to an attack was Vasily's wife, who returned at an inopportune moment. However, she didn't think to report it to the authorities. Instead, she obediently cleaned the blood from the floor and soon became so resigned to her husband's bloody trade that she even participated in the celebrations to lull the guests' vigilance. Afterward, she would take a bucket and a rag and get to work. The wife did her job conscientiously. Later, detectives tried to find any traces of blood on the floor, but were unsuccessful. After each murder, The Komaravs would fervently pray for the innocently departed souls, and sometimes the master of the house would even invite priests from the nearby church, and then, in gratitude, he would treat them to wine. Over the year, Komarav had dealt with 17 victims. One day, he realized that there were simply no free places nearby to discreetly store the bodies. The maniac then came up with a new scheme. After each murder, he would hide the body in a sack and, under the cover of night, transport it to the Moscow riverbank on a cart, where he would discard it. During one of these trips, Komarav was stopped by a police officer who inquired about the contents of the cart. The executioner, with an impassive demeanor, suggested that the officer personally check the sack. However, the officer declined and simply let Vasily go. After that, the maniac began bringing his wife on every trip to the Moscow River. The couple, in the maniac's opinion, did not arouse suspicion. However, the river proved not to be the best place to conceal bodies. Over time, they began to surface, frightening fishermen. The remains were also found by random passersby in the capital's back alleys. For instance, in a vacant lot by the horse alley, the remains of a brother and sister were found. They had traded at the Smolensk market. The investigation later revealed that Komarav had not intended to kill the girl and had only brought her brother home. During a feast, it became clear that the guest had not brought any money. All his accounting was at home. Komarav did not hesitate to go get it and then dealt with the brother as well. The maniac managed to stuff 2 bodies into one sack, but he was unable to bury them properly, leaving their legs sticking out of the ground. Soon after the horrifying discovery near Horse Alley, the townspeople found several bodies in a vacant lot next to an unfinished bathhouse. Komarav's victims continued to be discovered, and later the remains of 2 Muscovites were found. Fear gripped the city. Stories about the mysterious maniac spread from house to house. Vladimir Lenin personally ordered the capture of the executioner, and a real hunt was declared for Komarav. The best detectives and criminologists of the capital participated in the hunt, who, by the characteristic pattern, determined that all the attacks were the work of one person. They identified his likely hideouts and the sacks with traces of oats in which the bodies were hidden. The maniac tied them in a special way, and they realized they needed a cabbie. About 2,000 of the cuckers worked officially. Besides them, there were their own coachmen, and it was hardly possible to check every one of them through various city offices. On the other hand, the bodies of the victims were found in Zamosvoriki, which narrowed down the search area. The suspected killer was likely living somewhere nearby. However, even with this lead, it could have taken a long time to catch Komarav if the maniac hadn't made a fatal mistake. Misjudging his strength, he fractured the skull of one victim too deeply while trying to stop the gushing gauze. Shortly before this crime, he had become a father and, along with the baby, stuffed the body into a bag belonging to a family coachman from Zamosvoriki. The detectives quickly figured it out. In the spring of 1923, a special operations team arrived at Komarav's home. They cautiously informed the owner that they were looking for underground moonshiners. Not suspecting any trick, the maniac allowed the detectives in. He was not even bothered by the fact that a new victim's body was hidden in his house at that time. It was only after the operatives began to thoroughly inspect the floor that Komarav became suspicious. Not waiting for the inevitable exposure, the maniac jumped out the window and escaped. He managed to reach the village of Nikolskoye in the Moscow region, where he took refuge with a familiar milkmaid. There, the police caught him engaged in a rather odd activity. Komarav was writing memoirs about his brutal crimes, embellishing them considerably and turning accomplices into his own neighbors, among other things. During the investigative experiments, the police had difficulty controlling the crowd. The townspeople wanted to lynch Komarav, and some even demanded that the maniac be boiled alive. Rumors about Shablovsky the butcher, as the executioner was called, feeding his victims' entrails were calmly refuted by Komarav. "If I fed them, I would have raised more piglets." However, he did not deny the facts themselves. Komarav and his wife were examined by 3 of the best psychiatrists in the USSR, and their verdict was unanimous. In fact, the executioner was deemed insane. The trial of the first maniac of the Union was held in the Polytechnic Museum. Komarav did not deny his guilt, recounting his crimes with extreme cynicism. He referred to people as mere oddballs and described the process of his killings with the phrase once and kvass. He was indifferent to his own fate. While smirking at the expected verdict in court, the executioner provided details about his victims. But the investigation was only able to prove 29 murders. Nevertheless, the sentence was clear: the death penalty. The Komarovs were executed in July 1923, and their children were sent to an orphanage. Since then, the surname Komarov became synonymous with maniac in Moscow's everyday language. It was only during the years of the Great Patriotic War that people began to forget about the Shablovsky maniac. However, there were rumors that Komarov's son frequently executed civilians during the war, though these rumors were likely spread merely to instill fear.